I think self-awareness is huge. I think what happens is we get stuck in these ruts.
Hello and welcome to the Mindset and Self-Mastery Show. I'm your host, Nick McGowan. Today on the show, we have Steve Magness. Steve, how you doing, man?
I'm doing great.
I'm excited you're here. I think we're going to get into a lot of really good stuff. I know you've got a book that's coming out, and there's some. By the time this episode is aired, this book will be out. So you have a book that's out, and there's just a lot of cool things that we're going to be able to get into about mental health, mindset, and all those things. But Steve, why don't you kick us off? Tell us what you do for a living, and what's one thing most people don't know about you that's a little odd or bizarre.
Yeah, I'm a performance coach. What that nebulous term means is I help people try and deal with their mental and physical performance. I started out helping athletes. That's where my background is. I was a pretty dang good runner, and tried to help people navigate the mental side of that. And then I've expanded to help people from, doctors to, entrepreneurs to everybody in between, because performance is performance. Oh man, that's a good question. I could go a number of ways here. I think what I'll do is tell people how I got into writing, because a lot of people just think you're a writer. Always been good at it, right? And the answer is no. I used to suck at writing. In fact, when I was in high school, I was known as the kid who never read any of the books. I think I finished like one book in high school. I read this will date me, the Cliff Notes, and, took the test based on that. But I got into writing almost out of desperation. So as I mentioned, I was coaching. In this sense, I was an athletic coach. So coaching track and field was my profession at the time. And I went through this crazy experience where I essentially was a whistleblower against, the some Olympic coaches, essentially, for Nike, some of the top athletes in the world, and I saw them breaking some potential rules. So I blew the whistle to U.S. anti-doping, and there was a period of time there where it looked like there was no way in hell I was going to be able to have a future in my chosen profession. So I looked around and said, I need to pay for lawyers. And I was, again, a couple years out of college, making $42,000 a year coaching track. Um, I need to pay for things, and I need a potential backup career. So I said, you know what? I know about running. Why don't I just write about it? And my first book was all about how to train for, your marathon or 5K or what have you. And I was so naive. I looked around and tried to pitch it to all these publishers. Everybody said no, because I had no writing experience. And I just said, screw it. I'll self-publish this thing, and let's get some finances and see if it takes off. And lo and behold, even with all of the grammatical errors of a self-published book and not having any idea what I was doing, it did really well. And a couple years after that, it led to, my first real book with an actual publisher that didn't have grammatical errors and outside of the world of running. And that launched my career to do what I do now, which is, again, performance coaching, but also primarily I'm an author of, 5 books now, and writing is the thing that I do.
What a cool thing, especially to be able to look back and say, I didn't want to read, I didn't want to write, I didn't want to do any of that. And now here you are. It's a wild thing. Like, there are similarities. I couldn't help but like kind of smirk with it, because I used to tell people I hated reading even captions on TV. Like, I just didn't want to read at all. Did the same thing, Cliff Notes. Like, you're not, I guess you're dating both of us because I'm 40. So like Cliff Notes was our jam back then. And they didn't really crack down on the internet because it was still young, and it was like, all right, cool. But being able to not have to read, like, I remember the summer reading, they're like, you need to read The Hobbit or Fahrenheit 451 or whatever. The Hobbit I read because my dad read that to me as a kid, but the rest of it, I was like, ugh, I don't want to read any of it. Now I listen to audibles and read books and all of that. The process of writing a book can be daunting. Um, my partner has an agency that helps people with that, and I know that there's just an immense amount to go into it. Starting your first book, the idea, and then working through all of that all the way to your fifth can be an uphill climb, but it can also be one of those like downhill slopes where like you start to do it, you get used to it, you start to move through, et cetera, et cetera. I speak to this from outside experience because of the clients and people I've seen do that. But part of it, I look and go, wow, I know what that path looks like that I haven't written a book yet. But what a cool thing for you to be able to go through and understand that there's discipline within that. There's even playing the game within that and the athletic side of it. Now, timing wise, and when we're recording this, it's basically the end of January. And as I was prepping for our time to record this, I thought about the athletic side and just the amount of time and effort and energy that these people put into doing this one thing really, 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 really well. And then how that ties into personal development. And as a Philadelphia Eagles fan, there's a lot of people talking about inner excellence right now because AJ Brown was on the side reading this book. I mean, as soon as I saw it and he was reading it, I just went to Audible and downloaded it. And then I noticed it went up like, I think 58 million% in Amazon. Like Jim Murphy just basically became a millionaire overnight because of it, I assume. Um, but I think sometimes people can look at athletes and say, well, they're just a different breed, much different than myself in my corporate job, or much different than myself in whatever it is. And that is not always the case. They're just more in the spotlight per se. But what do you think when it comes to that sort of stuff? When people say, well, I'm not like that, or that's not me, so they really can't relate to it.
Yeah, I think you're onto something. I think you're 100% correct here because I think what I've learned in my journey, helping, again, starting with athletes, but branching out beyond that, is that performance is performance. And there are times where I kid you not, where I'm listening to, a physician tell me about like prepping for the surgery that he's about to, have to do. And I'm like, this is like an athlete warming up. Or when I got to talk to a world class drummer who, drums for Taylor Swift, and he's taken me through like the mental prep for getting out to go on stage. I'm like, this is an athlete going out into the arena. And I think even in those situations, we have to realize that like all of these ideas translate. Even if you're sitting down at your desk, it translates. And I'll give you a strange one, but a true one is in sport, we're used to thinking about the home field advantage, right? We play better at home. We got our home crowd. It feels more comfortable, all that good stuff. Well, research tells us that in our workspace, there is a home field advantage. So if we literally have decorated our office or have pictures of our family or loved ones or friends on our desk, that will signal I belong here and you will perform better. Researchers have found that if you spend 20 minutes decorating the place where you're about to have a negotiation with, opponent over, whatever salary, whatever it is, you will get more money out of that if you spent 20 minutes decorating versus if you just go into a random office that isn't, that doesn't feel like you belong. There are so many studies on this. And I think this is where I think, if listeners can branch out and be like, okay, yeah, it might not be the physical pursuit, but I can take some of these ideas because I'm still trying to get the most out of myself. I'm still trying to perform. I'm still often have to deal with expectations. Maybe they're not from a crowd, but they're my internal expectations of how I think I should perform, how much money I should make, what my career trajectory looks like. We can learn a lot from athletes in how to navigate that world.
Well, it sounds like you're kind of laying out one of those things that you've learned specifically from them and being an athlete yourself and seeing that in other people and then seeing that in like almost the normal folk in a sense. And to consider somebody to be normal in a sense of like you have a normal job that's not in the spotlight or in as an athlete or something like that, even somebody in their 20s or 30s that isn't doing something in a corporate job or running a business, but plays soccer on the weekends or something like that, we're still able to translate those things back and forth, but you got to see it. As you're talking about somebody prepping and decorating before a meeting, I picture somebody basically going into a boardroom meeting and being like, all right, before they get in here, I'm going to put up streamers and fucking celebration and stuff like that. And like the rest of the management walking in like, the fuck is all this? Well, I'm hoping to get more money out of you, you know? So, but that, I think that's also a crucial thing. Uh, my brain often looks thinks about things in like animations. That's why that stuff comes up. But if somebody's in a corporate environment and they're going to go in for their yearly review and know that they can probably get X% or whatever it is, they're still prepped for them to get their shit together. Not even just to say, like, I'm going to go in and sell them to give me more money, but like even walking in somewhere with confidence and just moving through the space to be able to do that. But that's just one piece of that. So why don't you break that down a little bit more of like what some of those macro pieces are that can be considered and thought about, but then kind of implemented in the moment without having to really think through it, you know?
Yeah, so the way I like to think of it is like when we step into the arena, whether that arena is an actual arena or your boss's office to have that performance review. What happens is our brain is predictive, and it says essentially like, it's doing this calculation that says like, am I prepared to meet the moment or not? And if I'm prepared to meet the moment, it changes how we respond to stress, meaning we start to feel a little bit more like adrenaline and excitement, where there's a little bit of nerves, but you're like, let's go. I got this. If we're not, our predictive brain goes, hey, we're not prepared for this. We don't have a good expectation of this. So we're going to make you feel anxious and afraid because we want you to essentially, self protect. And that's where we almost like shrink away, right? Instead of, saying what you believe and what you want to convey to your boss, you kind of just shrink away and just like, I'm going to be quiet so this can be over with as quickly as it can be. And if you look at, okay, which way do we go on that? It's the things that you just talked about, and more so, it's that confidence. It's, are you giving your brain evidence that you are prepared? It's the routine going into it. Are you signaling, I've been here before? It's it's how you view failure and success, right? If you see failure as this like self-defining moment, meaning like whether I get this like promotion or not is just going to cause me to be utterly devastated for weeks. If you see it like that, then your brain goes, well, this is a threat. Like, I don't want to be devastated for a while, so I'm going to protect, right? If you see failure as this thing that, yeah, it sucks, it's going to hurt for a bit, but like it's part of the process and I can potentially learn and grow from this and come out better on the other side, then that failure might sting, but it's not a huge threat. You go in to face the thing as a challenge instead. And there's all sorts of this, as well as is actually there's fascinating work that shows that whether we feel like a part of the team or belong also shifts how we see the space, or whether we see it as a threat or a challenge. So for instance, there's some research I talk about in the latest book, Win the Inside Game, that shows that if we are standing at the bottom of a hill by ourselves or with a friend, if we're standing with a friend, we will judge that hill to be 7 degrees shallower, and we will say yes if someone asks, do you want to sprint up it? Okay. Same thing goes. Researchers have done this when they've looked at like lifting heavy weights that, don't tell you how much they are. People will judge the weight after they've lifted it to be lighter when they are with friends or they feel connected or part of a team versus when they are going at it solo. So I also tell people, like, in your office, in your workspace, in your connection with your family at home, is like, we are meant to share the load. We are not meant to go on the crucible by ourselves. So if you create the space or the environment where you are sharing the load, you are going to perform better.
I'm sure we can all think about different situations that have happened where we go, oh yeah, that makes sense. Almost like going to the gym with a buddy or a trainer is different than going by yourself. And you can think, well, I can push myself, yeah, but if there's somebody else there, there's almost like this anti-matter kind of movement that's like kind of moving you along. Something I want us to also talk about and consider, and something that we talk about on basically every episode, is how trauma and how our attachment styles and just the different things that are kind of the untangibles, how that all relates to that. Because if somebody goes into that corporate, I just use that office meeting to say, they're going to get a raise or they're not going to get a raise or whatever. If somebody walks into that and has all this anxiety because of the things that have happened based on traumas that happened to them in the past, that's vastly different than somebody's going to walk in and may just feel a little nervous because they're unsure of what's going to happen or what's going to be said. And then there's also the person that is like the athlete that I think about the most, the quarterback that is has to be the calm, collected, and able to be sharp in all the toughest moments. I mean, right now, again, we're talking about things at the end of January. Jaden Daniels for the Commanders has had an incredible year, and it doesn't look like anything phases him. And he even said in an interview the other night that I saw where he was like, "But it shouldn't. I get to play a game." And I get to come out here and have fun no matter what happens. Like, what a beautiful way to look at that. But there's a piece of this where it's the mindset side of it and um, the mental attitude overall of like, well, I get to play a game, but also how do those traumas and how do those triggers and how do those anxieties and all of that kind of relate? So when you have clients that you're working with and people you talk to about this sort of stuff, how do you tie those together or help them kind of work through that to understand, yeah, there are these pieces, but it's not always the same for everybody.
Our experience sets the stage. And the way I like to explain it is that past experience, especially if it's traumatic, what it does is it sets that brain's prediction to be a little hyper responsive, right? You're going to see more threats. Why? Rightfully so, because your brain has been through a really hard spot or hard experience where it says like this sucked, this was not fun at all, like this hit us deep. I'm going to remember that. So in the future, when we're in a situation that might trigger a little bit of anxiety, your brain goes latches onto that past experience and says like, this is where I'm coming from. This might lead to that trauma again. Like hit the alarm. Where someone who hasn't gone through that, their alarm might not be as hypersensitive, right? They might not go from 0 to 100. They just go from 0 to 10. And I think it's really important to understand that we all have these kind of different set points here. And that could be based on your genetics, right? There's some research that shows that, some people are more sensitive to stress responses or others. Could be based on your life experiences, some of which you had no control of. I think the message though is this is wherever you are at, you can train your brain to kind of turn up and down that alarm a bit. Okay. And we're not looking for perfection here. No one, they might say it, but no one goes into a really difficult spot and experiences no anxiety. In fact, if they didn't, they would perform worse because we know we need a little bit of that physiological arousal or anxiety to perform well. So what we're looking at is okay, what can we do about it? And I think when it comes to traumatic experience as well, there's all sorts of research, especially in the research around post traumatic growth, that essentially tells you the most important thing is that trauma might always be there, but we get to influence almost the story around it and like how we internalize it. And this is where you go back to people like Viktor Frankl, who tells you, it's all about the response to the thing. We need to create space between that stimulus, the thing that is triggering us, and our response to the action. How do we create space? We integrate that story and have it make sense out of this. And I went through this as well. As I said at the beginning, a large part of my early career was going through this whistleblowing experience. And I got to tell you, I was an athlete who kind of thought like, hey, I'm tough. I'm resilient to everything. Yeah, I'm going to go through some anxiety, but I've performed in front of, on national TV in front of tens of thousands of people. It's whatever. But after going through that experience where I'm sitting across from, lawyers just grilling me and tearing me apart and trying to get me to trip up, for a couple year period, like anything difficult I was about to encounter, my brain would go back there and I'd feel that like tensing up. And I think the thing to listen here is that like if that's what you've been through, that's your brain and your body doing what it thinks is best. We just have to nudge it along and say, okay, I understand why you went there. I accept it. I get it. But like, that's not our only path. We can have other paths here to deal with the thing.
Oh yeah. And I think if we look at the situations before they become a situation, it's like doing the mental work beforehand. So many athletes talk about how they visualize how things are going to work out, and at the same time, you can also understand that it's potentially not going to go that way. You're going to do the thing you're going to do, but you can then change how that looks and be prepared to go into that situation. Um, Even like in the Inner Excellence book, it's talking about somebody being at a free throw line, just hitting a free throw that you've hit 1,000 million times, within the past week. Just being able to hit those over and over and over and over again. You think of all the NBA stars that just have literally hit tens of thousands of those shots. Geez, if we ask Steph Curry how many threes he's hit over the course of time, even on the opposite side of the floor, it's probably in the tens of thousands. But when the pressure is on and the story is created that if I don't hit this, I'm gonna fail, I'll be all these things. And it's how we manage that story. And yeah, I'm right there with you that we then get to be able to do something with it. But I think we can also take the time beforehand to think through those things. Because oftentimes we're not just instantly thrown into a situation that we were unaware of. Um, it's you get to prep for these things in certain ways.
The one thing that our brain kind of hates is uncertainty,
Sure.
right? Uncertainty gives us stress. So, like, think about it. If you're not prepared, if you haven't gone through a dress rehearsal, if you haven't gone through this like visualization process, like all of that is doing is signaling again to your brain and your mind, hey, we've been here before. We've thought this out. We have a plan. Even if you're faced by that pressure and it's like game on the line, like you have something to grasp onto. And I think this gets at a point that I think you hinted at there is that, often when we think of visualizing or prepping, we think of, okay, I'm gonna visualize it as if it goes perfectly. But what my work and some of the research actually shows is that we also have to like visualize and think about what happens when it goes wrong. How are we going to respond? Because what we're doing is again dress rehearsal, so that our brain can latch onto, okay, I missed that first free throw, but I need to make the second one to still give us a shot. Like, how am I going to respond when I visualized only making both of them? Right. And I think that is the key is like, you see this with athletes. LeBron James is famous for sometimes just practicing with his non-dominant hand, because you never know. Maybe you're going up for the like layup and shot on the right side and you're ready to go, but like a player gets up and has his hand in your face and you got to switch for the layup in the other hand or the shot in the other hand. Like, sometimes crazy stuff happens, so you get prepared for that situation. And I think, in our own lives, we need to do a better job of this. I sometimes practice, when I'm about to give a speech or something like that. I'll say, what happens if the PowerPoint or the slide deck just doesn't work? What am I going to do there when I don't have that crutch? I've got to be able to improvise on the spot and be able to do that, deal with it, besides just like freezing in the moment. So, like, that mental prep going into the difficult thing often sets the stage for being able to handle it.
I think there's a balance to it though, where you can get obsessed. Like you can work through everything, and then when it doesn't go the exact way you want it to go, you can freak out. And even with the situation like your monitor goes out or something happens to the slides, in pretty much all situations, people won't know it's a train wreck unless you scream, cry, and run off. Like, and even then, they may not know it's a complete train wreck. Like, there's still hope with those sort of things. And even if that were the case, where you screamed, cried, and just ran off and just disappeared, you can still learn from those things. And if that's worst case scenario, it's not like you died from it. And worst case scenario, you died. You no longer have to deal with the problem. Like there's positives to all of this, but not getting obsessed with it and also not trying to just psychically make it a thing. where I think there's something to walk through and work through, but allowing space, right?
Yeah, yeah, it's that fine line. I kind of call it in the book. I actually talk about it. I call it like the balance between like caring deeply or being obsessed and letting go. And the sweet spot is often like in the middle, because if we're obsessed, what happens? That obsession turns into perfectionism. That perfectionism turns into like trying to force our way to be perfect and get everything right. And whether we're talking about athletics or any sort of performance, when you start trying to like tighten up and force it, it backfires, right? On the flip side, if we just like are 100% loose and say, I'm going to let go, like none of this matters, life is bliss, like what have you, maybe we don't have that little, like just a little bit that says, like, hey, like you got to prepare for this. Hey, you got to show up. So it's like that middle ground between like caring deeply and being obsessed, and then just being able to let go just enough where we can free ourselves to perform. I mean, it's almost what Jaden Daniels got at, right? It's like that he has just enough perspective where he's not saying the game doesn't matter. He's saying I'm fortunate that I get to play a game. And I think that's more important, and a nice way to say it, more than like the game doesn't matter, or on the flip side, the game is all that matters. It's that middle ground that really is that sweet spot.
Hmm. Well, there's a part of me that hopes that Jaden Daniels gets the yips by Sunday and can't perform at all. But that's because I bleed green. And by the time this comes out, I hope I don't have to eat those words, but we'll see. So I think there's also kind of that balance too of not just the like going through those things and understanding that you can be obsessed and you could also not care and all of that. But this goes back to the the reps of it. You know, you've got to do this, and some of it is just doing it in your own mind to get some of those reps. Even if you get into a situation where it's like, "Oh, look, I've repped through this thing 10 different times in my head, you are already a few times ahead in the real life situation because you've repped through it, but without getting crazed about it. So I do find it interesting how there are certain people that are really, really just calm, cool, collected, like that's their jam, that's who they are. And then there are others that have gotten to that point because of the pendulum swing, where they've gone crazy on one side and they've gone crazy on the other side, and then they start to figure it out and get to that. And I'm sure there's a lot of people that you've worked with and athletes and people that you've talked to that maybe haven't said it directly like that with the pendulum, but they've worked through it so many times that it's like, oh, okay, cool. I've done this 40 times now. I get it. I've hit this free throw in tight spots at the end of a game 15 times in my career. I get it. But you've got to go through those things to do it. So are there any like um, almost tips or tricks or like feedback that you have from people that you've talked to regarding that specific thing?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're spot on with it. It's all about the reps. Confidence demands evidence, and evidence comes from putting in the reps, right? I think when we look at tips to do that a little bit better, I think what we see is like how you learn and internalize that matters a whole heck of a lot. So, what we know from psychology is that we have this like sensitive window period after like games or stressful performances, or even workouts where we're kind of pushing ourselves, where our brain essentially makes sense of the thing, right? And if we frame it, for instance, after maybe a tough loss where we miss that shot, if we take in that sensitive window period and just like that, lose our mind, think this sucks, like this is the end of the world, our brain starts to internalize it as like, you know what, I'm not going to learn from this. I'm gonna internalize this as something to avoid and almost bring that fear of failure. If instead what happens is we put our mind in a place where it's like, yeah, this sucked, or like this went well, but like what am I carrying forward? What that does is it makes those reps matter. Where I've seen this done really well is actually in track and field athletes who are like high jumpers, or long jumpers, because what happens is they only have a certain number of reps to like make the bar, right? It's like you either make the bar or you miss it, and if you miss it too many times, like you're done. So it's like do or die free throws. And what the ones who do really well is after every rep, so after they make or miss the bar, they'll go back, they got a notebook, and there's probably a million different things that went right or wrong. And you could try and remember them all, but research tells us that doesn't work very well. So what do? They write the one thing down that they want to take to the next jump. So maybe that's, last step, push off the ground more, or arch your back more as you're going over the bar, whatever it is. But instead of thinking of the whole thing holistically, they zoom in and take that one thing. And actually, when we look at the psychology around, really high pressure situations and athletes who are struggling with underperformance or choking or even the yips, what psychology tells us is, for instance, if you're kicking a field goal, um, and like you missed a couple in a row and your brain is spiraling, one of the best things you can do is essentially give yourself one spot to look at, one focus point, and say, I'm going to stare at this thing and just let it rip. And what it does in that moment is, the problem with the yips or choking or like any high pressure situation is our brain goes from focused to like taking in everything, and when it tries to take in everything, it takes in nothing. So by giving it that one focus point, you're just like, okay, block everything else out, like kick it in that spot. And what research tells us is it tends to help us in those high performance situations.
I'm sitting here kind of smiling to myself in some ways because I learned that specific thing in my early 20s by playing beer pong, and then
There you
learned it
go.
was a thing years later. And people would ask me, like, why the fuck are you just staring? I was like, because I know what cup I'm going for, and I know exactly where I'm going to hit it and what I'm going to do. And I would do it. And they'd be like, what the fuck? And I would like clean up the table, and like, who's next? And I realized, like, if I just focus on that thing, don't ever break contact at all, I'm going to keep nailing them and nailing them. I might miss every once in a while, but like, I'm, for the most part, going to nail it. And then learned it was a thing where it wasn't just, I was doing that because I was like, shit, I've drank too much, trying to like one eye it. Um, because even years later, like in my early 30s, I played water pong at that point and was just doing the same thing. It was like, oh, and coupling that together. So again, and the reason why I bring that up is to be able to tie this stuff together, where the more reps that we do and the stuff that we see, we may already be doing some of these things. We may also be sabotaging ourselves with some of these things because of different situations or scenarios or stories and things of that sort that have happened where we're just like, shit, you fall back into that. But just like everything that we talk about on the show, it's all self awareness. Like, I hope that people can listen to this and go, oh, you know what? Man, I do some of those things. Or, oh, that's cool. I didn't think about decorating or kind of getting my space together that can help. Or at least I've thought about that and maybe I could do something different with it now, and just being aware of it. So, for the people that are on their path towards self mastery, what sort of advice would you give to them?
I mean, I think self awareness is huge. I think what happens is we get stuck in these ruts. I call it like the rut of expertise or competency, where we get pretty good at the thing. And what then happens is we stop noticing and stop being aware. We're just kind of going through the motions, and that might help us for a little bit, and it can. But what it often does is it prevents us from like taking that next step on that self mastery, because like you need the awareness to understand like, oh, maybe I should try this things out. Or maybe I notice that when I do like show up to the office in a certain mood, or even maybe wearing a certain thing, like I have a better day, like things go well. And if you can be aware of those things, you can start to connect them. And then once you start to connect them, you can kind of start to make sense of like, okay, when I need to show up, like what are the things, what are the couple key things that really matter, instead of just showing up and being like, I hope this works. I hope I'm ready to go.
Yeah, like walking in and being like, all right, let's see how this works out. Man, that's a good point, and it's interesting how it's kind of a simple thing too, with the awareness of it. Like if you're aware of something, you are then aware of something. If you're unaware of it, how the fuck can you be aware of it? And I make this joke pretty often where it's like the more self aware you become, the more self aware you become. The more self aware you become, the more fucking self aware you become. But we get to do stuff with this. And I think for the most part, people that listen to the show are like you and I, where we enjoy this stuff. Where it's like the goal is to be able to be less bad than we were and a little smarter, or at least a little bit more aware to make some changes and do some things. Like even what you're talking about with pole vaulting, they're like, all right, well, next time push harder with your left foot, arch your back, or whatever it is. That makes sense to point out that thing because the rest of the path is already part of the process. It's internal. So I think if we kind of take that as an idea as well, where it's like, look, you do these things over and over, but what are the kind of outliers or the things that you can do that you can tweak just a little bit, where you don't have to make massive changes? Not always, sometimes you do, but oftentimes it's just those little tweaks over and over. So Steve, man, I really appreciate you being on. I appreciate you getting everything that you've done. And I love the fact that you were like, I hated reading, and now I've written multiple books because that's a beautiful part of our life journey to be able to work through that and just to let yourself become who you are. So thank you for being you. And before I let you go, where can people find you and where can they connect with you and get your books?
My website is stevemagness.com. I'm on all social, Twitter, X, Instagram, YouTube at Steve Magness. And you can check out my new book, Win the Inside Game, at Amazon, Barnes and Noble, wherever books are sold. I hope you check it out. And man, I really enjoyed this conversation. You're doing some great work, Nick. So keep it up.
Thanks, Steve.